incoming president of the Women in Aerospace, who is our co-host for this event.
On behalf of Women in Aerospace, I wanted to thank you all for coming today. I think this is a great turnout of basically a range of different folks inside of this community. I'm really pleased to be here as really the president-elect of really Women in Aerospace, and we are really pleased to be a co-sponsor of this, given our broad mission to really advance women inside of the aerospace industry. And specifically, we really see the great Professor Gabrynowicz as being a great example of a leader inside of the aerospace industry and providing so many contributions inside of this area. And so therefore, we're very happy to be highlighting a lot of her accomplishments and really helping to grow the dialogue around really sort of international disasters, and specifically the Disasters Charter. So thank you to the Commons Lab for basically organizing this, and specifically for asking us to co-sponsor. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Renee. So my name is Leah Shanley. I'm the director of the Commons Lab here in the Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm very excited today to be able to bring this event to you along with WIA. And also we'll have here today John Crowley, who's a public policy scholar here with us at the Commons Lab and at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and at National Defense University and at Camp Roberts. And got a couple of housekeeping things. We do have some folks on the phone. We have Brenda from USGS, Jennifer Chan from Northwestern University as part of the Digital Volunteer Communities, Troy from NOAA, and Bruce Davis from DHS. Those of you on the phone, we will call on you during the Q&A period. If you could mute your phone during the presentation so that we don't hear any background noises. Letting you guys know that the first hour of this session will be videotaped. That archive video will be posted to the web in a week or two. The second hour, we will turn off the videotape, and we will have a session discussing after action of Hurricane Sandy and the use of imagery. Both satellite imagery, aerial imagery from the Civil Air Patrol, and the engagement of the digital volunteer community. For those of you who tweet, we ask that you use hashtag DG2G for Grassroots to Government for Disaster Management. And I've been asked if we could do a round of introductions before we get started. So if we could start with Mark Brender.
I'm Mark Brender. I'm the Executive Director of the GOI Foundation. The foundation provides free satellite imagery to universities and NGOs around the world who need it for research.
I'm Larry George with Digital Globe.
I'm Neil Singh with MIT.
I'm Jill Chunkerman. I'm a consultant and a scholar here. I come from the oil side, and I'm interested in implications for oil spill response.
I'm Brenda Pomeranke. I'm a contracting officer with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency.
Hi, Major Charity Whedon, Assistant Attaché Air and Space Operations at the Canadian Embassy.
I'm Angela Pira, and I'm an independent consultant in space policy.
Good afternoon, Bill Mackey. I'm a counselor of U.S. Canadian Space Affairs at the Canadian Embassy. I'm with the Canadian Space Agency representative here.
I'm Judy Kelly. I'm a consultant with ATK.
Hi, I'm Erica Vick. I'm with NASA Office of Communications at NASA headquarters here in town.
Good afternoon, and my name is Renee LeDuc-Clark, and I am from DAI.
I'm Mikael Marin. I'm with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team.
Benson Wilder, State Department Humanitarian Information Unit.
David Sager, USAID off the Geographic Information Unit.
Hello, I'm Chad Blevins with USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance.
Hi, I'm Michael Grisalfi. I'm a senior advisor at FEMA for Whole Community Initiative.
I'm Koichi Kikuchi, JAXA, Japanese Space Agency's Washington, D.C. office.
I'm Jerry Scott, Naval Postgrad School. I work on the Camp Roberts Initiative.
My name is Chris Vaughn with FEMA. I'm Geospatial Information Officer, and my second time being late at a Wilson Center event.
And John Crowley.
All right, wonderful. I see a few more people came into the room. I don't know if you want to do a quick introduction in the back.
My name is Chris Barnard. I'm the Remote Sensing Advisor for the Geospatial Management Office.
Wow, great.
I'm the Environmental Homeland Security
Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. We really appreciate you being here. So with that, I'm going to introduce Professor Gabrynowicz. So Professor Joanne Irene Gabrynowicz is a professor of law and teaches space law and remote sensing law and is the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Space Law. A lot of law in there. Yeah. She advises U.S. federal agencies, including NASA, the Department of the Interior, and the Commerce Department, as well as international organizations on many facets of space and remote sensing law. Gabrynowicz is a frequent guest lecturer in the U.S. and abroad and is the author of numerous publications and academic articles in her area of expertise. So with that, I'll hand it over to Joanne.
Thank you, Leah. First, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and thank you. I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and Women in Aerospace for sponsoring this. I'd like to thank Leah for inviting me and doing all the legwork. I know how much that involves. And it's good to be with you all. At some point or another in my career, I've had the opportunity to work directly with a number of you, and if not you directly, your organizations or institutions. So it's a little like homecoming week for me. I'm appreciating it. All right, I'm going to be speaking today about the Disasters Charter, and as my introduction indicated, I am a lawyer, so I'm coming at it from a legal perspective, and I look forward to sharing that perspective with you. First of all, it's important to understand that the idea in the Disasters Charter, which is to coordinate space assets for the use of monitoring and hopefully responding to disasters, did not start with the Disasters Charter. It's an idea that was around for a very long time. It goes back to the 1970s. Jerry Soffin and a few others at NASA talked about the Global Habitability Program in the 70s. In the 80s, something called Mission to Planet Earth, also coming out of NASA, something that was addressed in what was then called the RIDE Report, had a similar concept. And then the Committee on Earth Observation Satellites, which is now in place in the 80s and 90s, also attempted to organize along this idea of coordinated assets. But this particular incarnation comes from the charter. The charter comes out of a proposal that came out of the Unispace 3 meeting at the United Nations. Unispace 3, as the name implies, was the third meeting, a UN-wide meeting addressing space. One had been in 1982, and I forget when the other one was, but this one came out with an actual recommendation that the assets of spacefaring nations are to be coordinated, and the purpose was to promote cooperative use of facilities among space agencies and systems operators for crises by providing data and participating in emergency operations. The charter that we're going to be discussing today was officially declared operational on November 1st, 2000. So it has a track record, a 12-year track record. And that track record to date includes approximately 355 activations and responses, which is a significant number. The principles of the charter and the activations attempt to provide timely and critical data at no cost. Significantly, it can be activated and has been activated by both developed and developing nations, as well as associated and cooperative bodies. And there are a number of organizations, entities that are attempting to build on the charter and do their work keeping in mind the charter purposes. Group on Earth Observations, which is headquartered in Geneva. The Global Monitoring for Environment and Security, GMES, which is a European effort, and it's developing as a European effort, and it is also intended to be part of Europe's contribution to GEOS, the Global Earth Observation System of Systems, which is the goal of GEO, the Group on Earth Observations, as well as the UN Space Technology Disaster Management / UN SPIDER. That name changed officially a few years ago, but in the literature you'll still see them both referred to. Who participates in the charter? I'm not going to read everything here. This will be posted later on, but these are the entities and the assets that are brought to the charter. And you will see that primarily you are talking about space agencies. There are other kinds of entities as well, but it's primarily space agencies, and the assets that they bring to the table are the satellites for which they are responsible. And here's more of the members. I plagiarized this. I took it straight from the website. This is how the charter is activated. And you will see that if you are a charter member, you can request a reactivation of the charter. The disaster occurs. The request is made to an authorized user, and we will come back to that concept later. That authorized user contacts an on-duty operator who then reaches, and I can't make this out anymore, an emergency on-call officer. There is a project manager who is on a case-by-case basis coordinating all of this. The various members, if they have relevant data and it's possible to be accessed, it is contacted, it is put into the hopper here. And you can also include value-added retailers. Those can be companies, those can be countries or operators, and then hopefully the data is made available to the end user for the purpose of the particular disaster. Now, what's important to keep in mind here when you talk about the charter is there is a lot of definitions, and these definitions are key in understanding who has the responsibility for doing what, who can do what, who can't do what. And so I'm going to go through these with a little bit of detail. So a party, that's a signatory, and anything in quotes here is language directly from the charter. It's not my language. So a party is a signatory agency and space system operator, so very specific. An associated body are entities that are rescue and civil protection, defense and security bodies or other services. And these are entities that are under the jurisdiction of the operator. So there's a jurisdictional link between other entities and the members that are activating and using the charter. These can also include member states of the European Space Agency and international organizations that is a party to the charter. Another category of entities are cooperating bodies. Cooperating bodies include the European Union, UN Bureau for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and other, and here's the key word in a lot of discussions, recognized. Other recognized governmental or non-governmental national or international organizations. So you can have a lot of IGOs and NGOs, but for the purposes of the charter, they have to be recognized. Beneficiary body, another key definition. Benefits from the crisis management information, for example, in the affected country. So this may be an entity that is not a member of the charter, but benefits from the activation of the charter at the site of the disaster. Natural or technological disaster. It's a situation of great distress involving loss of human life or large-scale property damage. A natural disaster is defined as, well, I'll give examples as a cyclone, tornado, earthquake, volcano, flood, fire. Technological accidents, for example, hydrocarbon, toxic, or radioactive pollution. I find this an interesting part of the charter because there is a great deal of awareness on natural disasters. There's a great deal of awareness on the Katrinas and the Sandys and the mudslides and the floods in China, but it also is intended to address technological accidents. Crisis. A crisis is the period immediately before, during, or immediately after the disaster, in the course of which warning, emergency, or rescue operations take place. crisis victims are any state or community for whose benefit the intervention of the parties is sought by the associated bodies. So there is a thought-out set of relationships here about who participates to the benefit of whom. Okay, other key definitions. Space data. It is raw data that is gathered by a space system controlled or accessed by a party, which in most cases is a space agency, and it is transmitted and conveyed to a ground station. Information, another category, is data collected and processed by parties using an analysis program in preparation for crisis management, use by associated bodies to aid beneficiary bodies, and this information forms the basis of extraction for products on location of the disaster or the accident. And I am going to get into analysis in a few slides, but I'm taking pains to show you the definitions. I mean, you could read this on the website. You don't need me to come here to show it to you. But I'm taking pains to let you know that there are defined groups, and these defined groups are what sets out the various relationships between and among them in the case of any given disaster. Space facilities, space systems or elements, and here's another part of the treaty that I find, of the charter that I find very, very interesting but doesn't get a lot of focus. It includes observation, meteorology, positioning, communications, and television. So the overwhelming awareness and the overwhelming focus on the kind of data that can be accessed through the charter is Earth observations and remotely sensed data. But that's only one form of information that is available. There's positioning information, communications, and others that can be called upon. And that is relatively less known, I think. So some key aspects. The charter is voluntary. There's no exchange of funds. And it's an organization that's carried out on what's called best endeavors, also known as best efforts. They shall undertake to maintain an up-to-date list of available facilities and descriptions, including, as far as possible, private or public operators to supplement the data that is needed. Notice the qualifiers in the language. Shall is an imperative. It means you must, you have to. If I have any engineers in the room, it's the same shall in your specs. You have to do this. Same thing here. However, that's qualified with as far as possible. And the qualification as far as possible takes into account the fact that you are literally addressing moving targets here. And depending on when the disaster occurs and which asset is in what location at what time and what its tasking record and what other priorities have been set for it at the national or the operator's level, the far as possible is intended to take all of those variables into account. Operational and technical coordination shall be provided by a board, and each party is to be represented. The Executive Secretariat implements the charter. And the charter stays in force for 5-year periods. And we're going to come back to this because that, to me, is also very interesting. And it shall be automatically extended, and it has been extended a number of times now. And we'll talk about that because that's particularly significant. So let's look at some of the initial issues, and I'm sure everybody in this room could identify these themselves. Issue, cost. Obviously, responses to activations can be expensive, and the budget tends to have an impact at the agency or departmental level rather than the national level. I mean, when you go into, for example, a discussion at the UN or a discussion among interested parties, you know, they'll say nation X or nation Y, and it really isn't at the national level in the big grand scale of things. It is really at the level of people who are in the trenches on a day-to-day level, who know what they're talking about, and who have to make decisions based on their own budget. So providing data set A or image B might be in competition with hiring scientist X. And those are the kinds of decisions, budget decisions, that have to be made. The agency or department makes a renewable 6-month commitment for a minimum amount of imagery or data. That was described to me by a number of people who made these decisions, is they literally sit down with their budget on a 6-month basis and say, how much can I afford to put into a line that covers imagery and data if the charter is activated? So it's a line in their specific budgets that they have to be able to provide in the event they are requested for it. Costs can be higher for some participants than for others. When the charter first came into being, and there are people on the phone and in this room who know better than I by now, but when it first was activated, SPOT was a very, very popular data set. Its resolution, both spectral and spatial, provided really relevant data for the kinds of disasters that were being responded to at the time. So initially, at least for a period of time, SPOT kept being asked for data more than other operators who also were being part of the charter. And that's something that may change over time depending on what kind of responses have to be made. And so charter members have to talk among themselves about, my God, I really got hit during this period and you didn't get anything. And maybe they can work something out on that base. And this is obvious. What they're trying to achieve is a balance between the agency's resources and the needs of the recipient, the first responders or the crisis management folks who need the data on the location. Another issue, access. And this is probably the issue that made my career. Is always, and access does not necessarily mean cost, even though cost is related to access. But access in the part that we're discussing today is simply who can get it or how can they get it. And the charter, like other instruments before, make a distinction between raw versus processed data and or information. There is an obligation to deliver raw data, but other products can be delivered if necessary. Question, who determines what's necessary? Is it the responder on the ground, or is it the image analyst in the operator's agency? Activation very often triggers service needs beyond data acquisition and distribution. This can go as far as value added. So the way I like to conceptualize this is you have a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have absolutely raw data, zeros and ones, mathematical values. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a really good detailed map, and that was derived at some point from those zeros and ones. And then there's the various stages in between. And the recipient of the data or the imagery typically, and there are massive exceptions to this, but just in terms of grasping the concept, the recipient wants to push to the side of the spectrum as far as possible to the completed product, the map. The donor typically wants to go in the other direction to provide as raw a product as possible, because it's in between those two ends of the spectrum that the costs get incurred. And depending on who can afford what or who has the capability for what, that movement is going to go along that spectrum. There's also other related issues that we're not going to get into here, but intellectual property is going to be another related issue about where on that spectrum it goes. There is, I am told, routine access to high-resolution data, but typically this is commercial or military data, and so you're going to have an additional set of considerations that will be catalyzed if this is the data that's involved. Some of the assets that fall in this category are the ALOS, Pleiades, Cosmos, SkyMed, Iconos, QuickBird, etc. Okay, another issue under the charter is how long a period does a disaster exist? When and how to end or change the activation. And this has a lot to do with the kind of disaster you're dealing with. So for example, usually with hurricanes, you have a fair amount of lead time as to how they are developing, when they're developing, when landfall is likely to be. But especially those of us who live in Mississippi, we know you can't predict that stuff to a fine degree. If a hurricane changes course, does that change the obligation under the charter? Does the disaster begin or end based on the movement of the hurricane? Or what if the damage that is expected is not going to be as much as was initially thought, and maybe the international assistance isn't going to be as great as was initially needed? How do you determine when to begin and end those contributions? Standard processes may be available, and I'm pretty sure the people who have to deal with these questions are probably learning this as they go. What kind of processes are they going to use? What kind of standards? Are there forecast methods, best practices that can be applied to determining the length and duration of a disaster? How about risk reduction as well as disaster response? So I understand that this was an issue in Katrina when we saw how big that thing was and where it was headed. And it was very obvious that there could be things done to mitigate risk, evacuation of personnel and communities, for example. So the original concept of the charter is disaster response, but in certain kinds of disasters like hurricanes, where it may be possible in advance to begin to mitigate or reduce risks, does the obligation to provide data or information extend to that pre-disaster period? And is there an obligation? Arguments could be made that you're going to be able to save lives and save money, but that isn't initially what the charter was intended to address. But I also understand it has developed, these ideas have developed over time. Related to ending or changing the activities. So again, I'm live in Mississippi, so I'm kind of hung up on hurricanes. I'm going to use those as examples a lot. The hurricane may change and go out to sea, but now you realize that you have land damage or loss of life that is another set of circumstances that need to be addressed. Can you do that under the charter? And how are the resources going to be allocated and paid for? Another issue, and this I find interesting, is one of culture and location. So there is increasing acceptance of understanding disaster relief and by disaster relief and civil protection entities. But depending on where the disaster is, you have certain sensitivities that you may not have in other locations. You're always going to have sensitivities if the disaster is near a border area. Borders are sensitive to begin with. And so if you're going to have a disaster at or near a border, you're going to be dealing with that extra lay of issues. A lot of mistrust. there's a residual perception of especially satellites, observation satellites, as spying in certain parts of the world. Nations that have a disaster that don't have their own satellites are very suspicious. They don't know how the technology is being controlled and whether it's being used for them or against them. Again, that's on a location by location basis. Also, there's just the fact that in a lot of areas where there are disasters, maybe mudslides, volcanoes, things like that, the crisis management entities that respond to those or manage those, they're not used to space technologies. They're used to using other kinds of technologies. And any manager in any organization tends to want to use what he or she knows and trusts. And if they don't know or trust or haven't used space technologies or space-related technologies before, that could be an added difficulty. Then what is the size of the affected area? This also relates to the border question. I mean, the disaster doesn't recognize a border. It doesn't say, okay, disaster on this side, but not on that side. So how do you define the size of the affected area? I know early on, a working definition was 60 kilometers by 60 kilometers. There are people in this room who know better than I do if that has changed. But typically it's going to be based on the event. If you have a volcano and the lava is flowing, how far is that flowing away from the volcano? Is that further area where the volcano flow included in the disaster area? Ongoing challenges. No surprise, operational financing on an ongoing basis. Capacity building, better use of techniques by both civil protection agencies, end users, and local authority decision makers, and ongoing evolving relationships among different kinds of actors. This is between and among space agencies and other actors of other kinds. And figuring out those relationships, which goes back to that terminology in the charter, authorized. How do you extend, if you choose, that authorized group of entities? Now I'm going to take you into lawyer land a little bit because I want to talk about the nature of the charter. It is legally non-binding, and what that means is the operators will tell you that, yes, this is on a voluntary basis. The charter members will tell you that this is voluntary, and we're doing this on a volunteer basis. We are not bound as a matter of law. A caveat, now this is a little bit of international public law. The definition of a charter that is most widely accepted is contained in the Vienna Convention on Conventions, which is that a treaty is any agreement entered into in writing, and a fundamental principle of international law is you assume you are entering into an agreement in good faith. That means no fingers crossed behind your back while you're signing the agreement. And so if it's an agreement in writing, it doesn't matter whether you call it an MOU, a treaty, a charter, or anything else. At international law, that is recognized by most nations as a treaty that has binding legal obligations. The United States is not party to the Vienna Convention on Conventions. There are parts of it the United States does accept. There are parts of it that the United States does not consider in its interest to formally adopt. And so our position toward, our formal position toward the definition of a legally binding agreement is variable. It also can change from presidential administration to presidential administration, depending on the administration's philosophy of foreign affairs and diplomacy. They may promote a more restricted definition of what's legally binding, or they may promote a more broader definition of what is legally binding. But it has the potential to become legally binding over time under international law if you can prove a couple of things. State practice. is there a sufficient number of states that begin to behave? The way you look at this is, what do nations do and what do nations say? If they behave as if this is a legally binding obligation, and if they take that action out of a sense of legal obligation, over time a document can become legally binding. This is very elusive. It's not the easiest thing to determine. If you were going to make that determination, one of the things you have to look at is various factors. So imagine yourself as a justice in the International Court of Justice, and somebody has come to you and said, has this document become legally binding? These are the kind of things that they would consider. How many times has it been activated? How frequently has it been activated? How many times has it been responded to? Because activation is just one half of the coin. The flip side of the coin is the response. And if you have activations without responses, well, that says something very different than activations plus responses. What is the quality and effectiveness of the activations and responses? What are the standards, if any, of the behavior established by these voluntary actions? Do we come close to best practices? Do we come close to requirements? Do we come back close to professional recommendations? What is the status of those standards that are used in the activations and the responses? What addition, if any, in any of those formal categories that the Charter provides for? What if there's an addition of parties, which are different than associate bodies, which are different than cooperating bodies? Flip side of that coin is, what if any of those entities withdraw over time? If you only have more and more additions and no more withdrawals, that says something different than if entities withdraw over time on a fairly regular basis. So it's both an analysis that depends on quantity and quality, both quantity of behavior, quantity of participants, as well as the quality of their behavior, how they behave. Other relevant factors. How many times has it been automatically renewed? This, I think, is probably one of the more significant factors, because if it keeps getting renewed on an automatic basis, that speaks to the intent of the entities to continue their obligations under whatever you call this agreement. You also have to look at related activities. The disaster charter does not function in a vacuum. You have to look at the context in which it acts. Are there related treaties or agreements? In space law, there's a whole treaty regime of 4 widely accepted treaties, 1 not so much. And those principles could be relevant to the disaster charter depending on the question that is being posed. Are there decisions of national and international courts that are relevant? So there are some very classic international cases, the Trail Smelter case about transborder pollution. Those kind of things may have relevance to a given activation and response. What does the national legislation say? So for example, in the United States, we have a pretty long history of federal legislation regarding remote sensing. And so we would have to look at what our statutes say as to how they may or may not play into our actions in the disaster charter. What are the opinions of national legal advisors and practices of international organizations? So one of the things that you see with the disaster charter is initially the UN began to organize entities, which now is UN SPIDER, and they can activate the charter as well, so how international organizations activate. And then relevant general principles of law, including, and these are the 2 big ones for the disasters charter, is what is the legal relationship between a state and an agency of that state? And what ability, if any, can an agency, what kind of activities can an agency take to bind a state? I'll come back to that in a few seconds. So those are the things that a justice would analyze to determine at what point in time, if any, the disaster charter has changed and become something else. Okay. Let's pull the analysis out a little bit. The disaster charter is only an example of a trend that has been happening in the last half of the 20th century, say roughly at the conclusion of World War II. What we see is a proliferation of different kinds of instruments and legal instruments that also have political character to them. And so we have statement of principles. For our purposes, the UN principle on remote sensing, principles on remote sensing are relevant to the disasters charter. Memoranda of understandings, memoranda of agreements. MOUs have grown in use dramatically since the end of World War II. And in the view of many scholars and actors, MOUs are treaties, even though in a lot of places they're not given the name of treaty. Codes of conduct, we see that, for example, in the questions of the use of missile technology in space. Codes of conduct, codes of behavior. Charters, this is a charter. So all of these are new kinds of instruments, relatively new kinds of instruments that really came into being in the last half of the 20th century. And they are catalyzed by a good faith intention, which is it's trying to avoid the complexity and complications of a formal treaty-making process, which can be very restrictive and very cumbersome. And there's looking for a flexibility, especially in agreements that deal with technology and technology that tends to change on a fairly rapid basis. The formal treaty-making process that we understand today that began in the 1700s is less agile for a lot of the things that we need to do with technology. These are new forms of international relations and institutions. They are growing more quickly, and as regards to space, because the space treaty regime does have a basic principle of international cooperation, and in the United States, if you read the National Aeronautics and Space Act of 1958 as amended, international cooperation is one of the reasons why NASA was created and why the space program was established. So because there is an intention that there be international cooperation, which the Disasters Charter also addresses, there has been a need to have more and more of these new kinds of instruments in place. This is captured best in a declaration of the UN called the Declaration on International Cooperation. And, quote, states are free to determine all aspects of their participation in international cooperation in the exploration and use of outer space on equitable and mutually acceptable basis. What this means is it doesn't have to be a treaty. But if it doesn't have to be a treaty, does that mean your obligations are less sincere or less respected? And that's what these new instruments are starting to address. However, this is the interesting part. The more effective these informal and new instruments become, the more it may be that they become recognized as authoritative in a way that is analogous to treaties. And to analyze that, you have to look at the success of both the economic and political importance of these. What do they actually get done? Because that is an important part of their efficacy. So the real question, the big question for all of these kinds of agreements is, at what point do trends away from the status quo become the new status quo? And it's my professional opinion that in 100 years from now, people will be looking back at this point in time in history, lawyers, and saying, That's when they created the bloppity-blop system, whatever it is. I don't know what to call it yet, but it's analogous to, I can now look back to the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s and the 1700s and say, that's when the treaty system emerged. Something else is happening now. I'd like to give an example of that. That really hit me. I was an observer at the Group on Earth Observations, and there's two categories of members. There's the nations, and then there's participating organizations. And there's a complex relationship between these two groups of members. And just the fact that you have an organization that has nation states as well as something else as members, even with different responsibilities and different hierarchies, that's a significant fact. And one day they were talking about something, and the EU representative said, well, our interpretation of that is da-da-da-da-da. And then the French delegate raised his hand and said, well, let me clarify the French interpretation of the European view. And then the German delegate raised his hand and said, let me give you the German clarification of the French clarification of the European view. And that's when I realized something is changing. Something is really happening now. And so that's the academic in me. 100 years from now, people will look at those events and say, that's when these things happened. So the analogy I like to give about when do these things become binding or not is it's more like a dimmer switch than an on-off switch. There's no one point where you say, bing, that's when that became legally binding. It's more like slowly turning the dimmer switch in a room and the light begins to come up, and you may not be aware of it, but all of a sudden the room is light. And you look back and you say, it happened then. And I think we're in that period now. This is the classical agreement structure that has been in place for centuries. This is the nation-state system as we understand it since the 14, 16, 1700s, where you have sovereign, independent, standalone entities, and decisions are made at the top, and the decisions are made at the top, from the top, to the top, to the top. And that's the treaty-making system. That's the system that says all nations are sovereign and equal, even if that's not true in terms of economics and military and other indicia. It's a legal fiction, but this is the system that we have been doing. What the Disasters Charter is doing is this. Because I'm gonna need to stand. What you have here is you still have the tops of those pyramids, and they are all in discussion. I'm sorry. Thank you. You still have the tops of the pyramids, and they are all in relationship. But these are the guys at the bottom who are doing the work, and they are going to where they have to go. This is, okay, your satellite is here, but your data is here, and oops, this is where the disaster is. And they are working it at that level. And so understanding that this is a kind of a network within a hierarchy, I think gives some understanding to what the Disaster Charter is. So I'm going to conclude with some of my own observations. I mentioned the UN principles on remote sensing, which are primarily in relationship to the environment. There are definition differences between the Charter and the principles. There's definitional differences between data and information, and that is always going to be the case in anything that has to do with Earth observations or remote sensing. But there are common features. The Disasters Charter and the UN principles both specifically aspire to protect human life and to protect the environment. And in these principles, they reinforce one another, and I think that's a significant observation. In the 20th century, we were very used to talking about developed and developing nations, which also meant poor and rich nations. And while that certainly is true to a very large degree, that very stark dichotomy is changing. So for example, you have countries like Nigeria and Algeria who have satellites, and they are not the big spacefarers, But from a legal perspective, it doesn't matter how large the satellite is. Once the satellite is in space, it raises two major questions for a nation. One is, do I become party to the treaties? And two, do I need national legislation to protect my national interest? And I think that's an important shift that has been happening in the last 15 years or so. And so that's a less accurate description of the participants in the charter. And again, this is based on what used to be called field work before the internet got around. I think the reality is when you look at the charter, you're looking at a handful of dedicated, motivated employees who really do want to make it work and who are have to make decisions at a relatively lower level in their organizations. It's not the presidents of the world or the ministers of the world that are making these decisions. And in short, I think the charter is working. So I want to leave you with this academic quote. This is by an extremely well-respected scholar in international law, Oscar Schachter. And this comes from a paper he wrote called The Twilight Existence of Non-Binding International Agreements. The fact that non-binding agreements may be terminated more easily than binding treaties should not obscure the role of the agreements which remains operative. As long as they do last, even non-binding agreements can be authoritative and controlling on the parties. There is no a priori reason to assume that the undertakings are illusory because they are not legal. To minimize their value would exemplify the old adage of the best is the enemy of the good. It would seem wiser to recognize that non-binding agreements may be attainable when binding treaties are not, and to seek to reinforce their moral and political commitments when they serve the ends we value. And I think that's a good description of the Disasters Charter. And with that, I will take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Joanne. I think I'm going to use them. Yes. And so as moderator, I'm going to ask the first question. There's a new breed of volunteers that support the traditional response community. In the last 2 or 3 years, and even maybe before that, there's the emergence of digital volunteers who monitor and synthesize social media feeds, develop software applications, process satellite imagery, digitize base maps, and now collecting imagery through aerial cameras. You touched just briefly on parties that are groups that are not necessarily signatories to the charter. How might these new digital volunteers get access to the data during a disaster to support the needs of the response organizations?
Well, I think they need, if that's their goal, they need to get busy before the disaster, and they need to create a formal relationship so that they become an authorized entity with whoever has jurisdiction in the country they're working with. So whoever is a charter member or an associated body, if those are the entities that the digital workers think would be providing the data in advance, at the time of a disaster, in advance, they should try to sit down and work out a formal relationship.
Okay. So that would be okay under the charter then if they have a relationship established prior
It's
to
voluntary. It's not required. If the member feels for good and proper purposes that, remember that qualifying language as far as possible, that might hinder their ability to meet their legal obligations, they may see it differently. Another element of this is the data can come from different satellites at different times depending on what the disaster is. And as you see in the list of members, you have a mix of government, private, commercial data providers. And here I have to really stress something. When we say commercial in the United States, we mean private sector. That's not true in most of the world. In Europe, Canada, Japan, most of developed democracies, when they say commercial, they also include government because it is okay in their systems for the governments to generate revenue. So because you have all these different kinds of sources for the data, you're going to have different intellectual property interests, you're going to have public good interests, you're going to have profit motives, and depending on where the data comes from, you're going to have this panoply of interests that might be really difficult to deal with at the point of disaster.
First question.
Second question.
Second question is, get the mic over there.
You mentioned that one of the aspects of having a non-binding agreement, or charter in this case, turned binding, was the number of automatic renewals. The charter I printed off at the web is April 25, 2000. So is there a more recent version, and who's responsible to take this charter to the higher levels, to the people who have signed it already, to go make modifications? And in your point of view, do you think this charter, although it's working, requires modification given the new commercial entities that are launching satellites with imagery capabilities, and where are we going in the future? You said this is a stage in the history of man, which we will look back into 100 years. What needs to be done in order for that to happen?
Well, that's about 3 questions. Let me parse them. The first one, it's now 2012. You have a document from 2000. The charter period is 5 years, so obviously it's been extended a number of times. Because it's an automatic extension, it implies that they don't have to go to anybody. They just keep doing what they're doing. Does the charter need to be modified? I would need to do some serious empirical research before I could answer that question, because it really would mean sitting down with the people in the trenches saying, how did it work for you? What did you do? What was your obstacle? If there was something different you could change, that's the kind of data that I would need to be able to answer that question. Well, there are commercial ventures already. There's the U.S. companies. There's a couple of consortiums, the DMC consortium, I believe they function on a commercial basis. But again, this is where it's important to understand how you're defining commercial, because for the non-U.S. participants, those commercial activities are also government activities. For most of the countries around the world, commercial is defined as generating revenue, and it's okay if a government does that. In our system, our definition of commercial is private sector. There is a huge, wonderful conversation that can be had about how close we are to each version in our own country, but in general, that's what you have to ask yourself from. Because if it is a government commercial activity, then you need to know, do they have to recover their costs, which in Europe, that's the model they use. In the US, we have a public good model, and again, massive exceptions to this, but the general principle is something that is a public good, we don't cost recover on. So all of those financial interests come into play at the point of the disaster. What can they do? What do they have to do?
Next question. Well, that's going to be very much on a country-by-country, agency-by-agency basis. So let me give you one tiny example. The Landsat satellites. Under U.S. remote sensing law, you cannot amortize the cost of the satellite. So our legislation recognizes that whatever money went into building, designing, launching the satellite, that's a sunk cost. You can't try to recover that. In Europe, they have a very different model, which is if the users don't want the data, then the government's not going to pay for the satellite. If the users want the data, then they're going to pay for the satellite. And they grapple with that a lot. They're doing it now with Galileo again. And so what constitutes a cost
is going to determine very much on the local legislation.
Hello, and thank you for coming out and giving this talk. It's excellent.
Thank you.
My question, and I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, pertains to the legal restrictions of data access once scenes have been collected and handed over to the charter. I've heard all types of kind of rules behind who can then access the data. Can you give some clarification, please?
You're going to get tired of this answer. It depends. Because just like the costs are determined, just like all politics is local, all costs and access is local, because it has very much to do with the fiscal and the philosophical constraints on the data. If you're dealing with a commercial company, as we define it in the United States, their access is going to be based on their license, restrictions that the license have, and requirements. So for example, commercial remote sensing companies in the United States cannot deny data to a sensed state. That doesn't mean it has to be free. The terms and conditions can be negotiated, but in our licensing system, they can't deny it to a sensed state unless there's another restriction that has been placed for other reasons. Spot is going to have its versions of that. Under German law, you want to be glad you're not distributing data under German law, because under German law, they have this concept of a box. All of the data is in a box. And they don't care if you are a value-added retailer, whether you are a satellite operator, or you are just a seller, a vendor of data products. If somebody comes to you and says, I want the data that's in that box, and you want to facilitate it going out of the box to that party, you have a decision tree that the government gives you. If it's this, then that. If it's that, then this. And you go through that list of questions, and at the bottom you conclude whether it's okay to make that data available to the entity that has requested it. If you go through that decision tree and you decide it's okay, and you move the data out of the box, and you're wrong, you go to jail. So you're going to have different people looking at very different factors on their own personal choices, their own professional choices.
So it comes down to the provider, basically, when they hand the data to the charter.
In general.
Okay.
In general. It's what is the data provider constrained by or allowed to do?
Okay, so we have two questions. One, John Crowley, and then in the back there. Yeah.
So I have a question. I'm going to come back to some of the technical communities that have been generating geographic data based on imagery. What we saw in Haiti was an incredible mapping activity that occurred after the earthquake. Digital Globe and GeoEye both made imagery available, essentially created a period during which imagery-derived products could be created freely, and those imagery-derived products were mostly maps of streets, down buildings, that proved to be the base map on which the response ran. Most of the formal entities use that data set in order to plan their formal logistics operations. Fast forward to Pakistan and the floods. The lack of availability of imagery greatly hampered the response and greatly hampered the ability for generation.
Why was the data lacking?
That data, when it was requested, there was no method of getting imagery-derived products created from it. The access was very tightly controlled. Now,
because
obviously,
so is Pakistan.
That was the question I was
and
coming to.
not Haiti.
Haiti, the government had it basically imploded. Pakistan, we have a level of paranoia that is now, as you're probably aware, creating a potential law to outlaw the act of mapping.
There are laws like that exist. One is in Abu Dhabi. Another one is in Dubai. There are countries, and here, I'm sorry, I have to put my professor hat back on here, because we are dealing with vestiges of colonialism that started 400 years ago. And that's what we are that's what we are really dealing with, is you are dealing with cultures for whom technology was always used against them. and they couldn't understand it, and they didn't have access. And in those days, the technology meant trains that took out tin, okay? So now when you are talking about maps, when you are talking about satellites, which they don't have, there is a huge amount of mistrust because for 400 years, that's how they have dealt with technology. And maps in a lot of these countries are state secrets. You're not going to change that with a response to a single disaster.
So my question, when the assessment is made over what to release under the charter, how much of the sovereignty's concerns are integrated into the release and the access rights to which, not parties, but all the various associated entities in that new network, how much is that integrated into the decision-making process, and how is that influenced?
Well, that's why it's interesting that the charter is between and among agencies, because the agencies are the operators, and they are going to know what national restrictions, what national interests, and some of them are valid, some of them may be frivolous, but they're going to know what the restrictions are and what they have to be responsive to their internal authorities. And that's how they're going to be making their decisions. If it's a company, and the company has interest, including intellectual property and hopes for repeat sales, at the point of distribution, those are the factors that are going to be making their decisions. So if it's an agency, the sovereign interests are going to flow down to them through the head of agency down to where they are and what their job descriptions are and what kind of restriction is on what kind of data.
So the implication is that places with authoritarian regimes that are in the highest disaster risk areas with high vulnerability populations are probably the ones going to be least benefiting from the charter.
And that truly is the tragedy, is that the places that can use this most are probably the ones that are most fearful. And you can't make them not be afraid.
We have a question in the back first, and then Mark Brender
It's
afterwards.
more of a comment. Tom Willoughby, DHS, just offering a government perspective and a comment on the cost question. There's another element and aspect of that, too, in terms of dealing with prioritization of acquisition and in terms of missed acquisitions or lower priorities that could be considered as part of cost, non-monetary cost.
I'm Mark Brender with the GOI Foundation. GOI and Digital Globe can collect imagery at better than half meter ground resolution or 19-inch ground resolution. Often in the case of disasters, people come to the companies and they want the higher resolution imagery because the imagery...
Which way is the data, which way is the lava flowing? You don't need a 15-inch picture for that.
They want higher, more detailed imagery because you can see much more detail in the higher resolution imagery. You can see the corner of the house that's moved. You can measure maybe how much it's moved. You can look at how much sand is on the driveway and measure that with the higher resolution imagery. However, current U.S. policy says that we have to, Digital Globe and GOI, blur our imagery to resample it to half meter ground resolution, which provides a lot less service, a lot less knowledge to those people who are using the imagery, trying to make accurate maps and damage assessments. Are you aware of any moves that are going to be successful in getting this imagery restriction lifted so both these companies can sell, imagine that, their best resolution products?
No, I'm not aware of anything right now. I've just been invited to participate on the resurrection of an advisory committee, the Advisory Committee on Commercial Remote Sensing. We've had one meeting that was introduced to us as something we will address, but I have nothing more to say than that.
Any other questions? Oh, over here.
Coach Kikuchi from JAXA, Japanese Space Agency. Thank you for your presentation.
If you could speak up, we have trouble hearing you here. Is that my phone?
My question is, you mentioned the trend to shift to the more soft binding in instrument.
soft law instruments.
Yeah, soft law, yeah. Is that trend just for space activities, or other areas have such trends?
Let me bring everybody else in on the conversation. Soft law is a term of art that is being used to describe agreements that are reached in a non-binding, non-treaty way for the purpose of promoting political action. And soft law is very much a trend in space law. I can't speak too much to other laws because I'm not an expert in that area, but I am aware of them in arms control and other applications, environment. Now, whether soft law really exists or not right now is a subject of heated debate among the academics and the experts, because the purpose of law, any law, we have law so that we can have stability and predictability. Stability and predictability to the extreme is fossilization, and we need something more agile than that. So that's where the soft law is starting to come in. But soft law to the extreme is anarchy, too. And so I think the best way I conceptualize it is, I think we are in a time period where we're trying to figure out what kind of agreements we can use other than the formal treaty-making process, but which has authority and moral obligation. So the whole soft law discussion is about that right now.
Okay. I'm going to see, does anybody on the phone like to jump in with a question or a comment? You guys still there?
Yeah, Brenda. Go ahead. Go ahead, Brenda. Well, Joanne, I was just going to say thank you very much. I found this most just really enjoyable. I learned a lot. Appreciate it.
Coming from you, that's pretty good. Thanks.
Any other questions there?
Joanne, this is Bruce.
Howdy.
I was wondering, you may have addressed this to a certain extent with your answers to the other questions, but I just wonder what the opportunity is, or if there are any barriers under the Charter for remote sensing data acquired for response purposes to be kept by the country that was impacted by the disaster and then later shared for non-response purposes.
Well, this is almost a satellite by satellite answer. So, for example, back to Landsat. If we're talking about Landsat, the law and policy that governs Landsat allows the data to be made available on a non-discriminatory basis to other countries, who then can make it available, and in fact are encouraged to make it available to other entities on a non-discriminatory basis. So that's not going to be a problem for the Landsat systems. Spot, what kind of agreements do they have with the local ground station? Some countries are very adamant that they don't want redistribution or third-party use. I believe some of the Japanese satellites are in that category, and they have their reasons for that. So again, it's on a satellite-by-satellite basis.
Okay.
And in some cases, it could be on a sensor-by-sensor basis.
Well, and I just wonder if there isn't a role for GEOS here in the sharing of those data, or the housing of those data for a community-wide utilization.
Well, I can tell you this about GEOS, because I was...
You define GEOS for some people in the room?
GEOS is the Group on Earth Observation Systems. This also came out of a recommendation in 1984 in what was then the G7, and a recommendation was made that nations that had satellites should coordinate the use of their satellites for efficiency and equity. The United States took the action item of holding the first summit on doing that, GEO-1, and then GEO was established as a permanent entity. It's housed in Geneva, sharing space with the World Meteorological Organization, and its purpose is to coordinate all these satellites in something called the Group on Earth Observation System of Systems. Okay, so I'm part of that too. And one of the things I was asked, along with other people, including Paul Euler at the National Academies, was to come up with a data policy for GEO, because there were data sharing principles that were agreed to by the member states when they established GEO. And the whole idea was, if we don't have data sharing, what's the point? Why do we do this? And so those data sharing principles, and you can get them on the website at GEO, are what they abide by. And then we went further and wrote documentations about what those meant and how they could be implemented. So if you want to download that, you can look at it now. And it's been adopted. It's so complex because so many different nations have so many different reasons for having satellites and what their goals with those satellites are. I will say, in my opinion, there is a silver lining coming out of this complexity, and that is, I have noticed since the early 2000s, about 2004, that with the end of the Cold War, the days when any country can go to their national legislature and say, pay for a satellite, are over. Because the national legislature and our OMB and whatever the counterpart is in other countries are asking, what's the value? And how do you answer what's the value of a satellite? People use the data. And so now there is a growing, and it has been growing for a while, in satellite operating nations to demonstrate the value of their satellites so they can justify funding the follow-ons. And because they now have to justify the value of their data, they are trying to figure out ways to get it into as many hands as possible, because that's the metric that you need to prove the value of your satellite. So, and that's happening in the United States, it's happening in France, it's happening in Japan, it's happening in most countries that I have studied. And so if that trend continues, that they have to continue to justify the value of the satellites, it's going to be a forcing function for cooperation, in my opinion.
I want to tag on to that Molly McCulley, our senior colleague at Resources of the Future, did an economic analysis of the value of Landsat, and you were on the Landsat Advisory Committee on the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. And Brenda, I don't know if you're still on the phone, whether you want to comment when USGS changed the policy and opened up access to Landsat for minimal cost, the skyrocketing in use. You want to comment on that, Brenda?
I don't have the exact numbers, but we distributed, I think, more data in, I'm not sure the numbers, like I said, like in 3 months or 6 months than we had in all the previous years that we distributed Landsat data. The amount of usage increased so dramatically. I don't think anybody expected that. And I think they did the study on return on investment and stuff, and the numbers were astounding. I don't have them at my fingertips, but if anybody wants it, I can find the document and share it with you, I think.
If you shared it with me, and we can post it to our website that people can find when the video gets posted.
You can also download it at the NGAC website, the National Geospatial Advisory Committee. We have that there. I want to tag on there because that's something important, which is when you think about satellites, if you think about GPS, if you think about the weather satellites in the United States, we don't talk about charging for the data, because in the US model, data distribution is achieved by the private sector and the citizenry. We see that as an integral basis of getting the data out there. So the AccuWeathers of the world and the TomToms and the Garmins of the world, those are the entities that distribute the data. In other systems, it's not seen that way. In Europe, they still see the satellite and the distribution as one, and the satellite distribution as being something that has to be more controlled. So again, you have to ask yourself, what satellite are you talking about, and almost what sensor are you talking about to know what the data access and restrictions are.
Are there any other remaining questions? Okay. For those of you who'd like to stay, we're going to do a second session, more of an open roundtable discussion on after action after Sandy and the use of imagery, both satellite, aerial, and the work that the digital volunteer communities do. We've got Chris Vaughn here, the new GIS coordinator, but formerly remote sensing coordinator for FEMA, who will make some opening remarks. And John Crowley will talk about the use of Civil Air Patrol for data for imagery collection. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and Chris.